Know when you want.
Yep. You are ready, Mark.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. This is Mark Perlman, the author of The Reluctant Soldier, and I want to thank everyone for being on this Zoom call. I know it's more limited than being in person, but we have some people that are out of state, and I'm glad they joined. So that's all good. Writing a historical novel for any author gives the person license to make up things that that are not real. But if it's a historical novel, they certainly have to be very accurate on what is historical, whether it's people, places, events. And that took quite a while in researching the book. It took me over 10 years part-time to research the actual people, places, events that are weaved in with the fictional people throughout the book. So on this next screen is my elevator talk about the book. An elevator talk is where someone asks you, Mark, what's your book about? And you basically have 10 seconds to give a cogent, specific, succinct response. So you all could read that. I won't need to bore you with reading it myself, but that's my 10-second elevator talk about the book, what the book is about in gross generality. The main character is Virgil Carpenter, and he is, yes, a figment of my imagination, but his life is weaved through, as I mentioned, the real people, places, and events that transpire in the late 19th and up to basically the 1970s until his death. Most of what I'll be talking about are the pictures that are on the front cover. And I'll go over each one of these people and places with you in this little journey. If you can see it, the book was originally published in French because most of the book takes place in France. So the book is published in French and in English. And that was a journey in and of itself to get that done. So why did I write this particular story? It's my first book and arguably my last book. It was a passion project. I am not a professional author. I am not a professional speaker, but I had this passion about the subject matter. And after about 15 years, I gave birth to the book last fall. I like to think of it as history that entertains. By that, I mean, I've read a lot of history books, or specifically nonfiction books. And some of them can be very, very tedious because the books get into the weeds on minutia of history and all the footnotes attached to it. I didn't want to do that. The history of these events and the people have been well documented, but I wanted to create kind of a Woody Allen Midnight in Paris type of book. If you've seen the movie, then you know what I mean. If you haven't seen the movie, I would recommend it. Secondly, I wanted to keep the memory of the First World War, more commonly called the Great War in Europe, alive. It is a conflict and a catastrophe that lives with us today, and I'll get into that as we progress on through the presentation. And I wanted to have the great events and fascinating people from our main character's point of view. So it's a very personal historical fiction. There's a couple of other takeaways for the book that are, again, weaved into the chapters of the book. So the book basically covers from pre-Civil War up to the 1970s, which is a long period of time. Arguably, most of the book takes place from about 1915 to 1945. So for the purpose of this abridged presentation, I will just say that in the beginning of the book talks about Virgil's ancestors escaping slavery after the Battle of Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1862. And after the Civil War, his ancestors start a farm outside of Fredericksburg and scratch out a living. Virgil is born in 1891 during the Jim Crow era in the South. He's born 5 years prior to the famous Supreme Court decision named Plessy versus Ferguson. Some of you might be familiar with that Supreme Court decision, but that was a landmark decision that stated that the races in America could be separate but equal. That kind of started the Jim Crow codification of laws in the South, and I think more covertly in the North, about the segregation of the races. To move on in the story, as a young man, as a teenager, Virgil has fate shine upon him. He saves the life of a young white girl from being trampled by a team of horses. And it just so happens that this little girl's father is the bank president in Fredericksburg. And he bankrolls Virgil's college education in gratitude for saving her life. Virgil goes to the Hampton Institute in Norfolk, Virginia, which is a segregated college for African Americans and Native Americans. It's a co-ed school, and he graduates the institute with a degree in English literature in the early part of the 20th century. So the book chronicles his escapades, him and his roommates during college. And after college, he decides to get a master's degree in the City College of New York up in Harlem. So he decides to get a master's, and he decides to make a significant sea change in his life by going north. I just wanted to show a picture of Fredericksburg during the Civil War. Now, mind you that these pictures are taken from the public domain, and they are not in color. Someone asked me several months ago, he said to me, "Mark, you should have a lot of your presentation in color." And I just remarked that color photography was not the norm back 100 and something years ago. So I apologize in advance for the quality, but that is the best quality I could come up with. So Virgil is up in New York. He's getting his master's degree at the City College of New York up in Harlem. And his roommate is a musician for a very famous nightclub called the Clef Club. And his roommate gets Virgil a part-time job as a waiter there. And it's at that club he meets his future wife, Beatrice. And he meets other very famous people in New York. And I'll get, I'll get to them. But Virgil is now very busy getting his master's degree, being a waiter to earn extra money. And he's also teaching undergraduates English literature. So he's a very busy young man, and he's courting his future wife, Beatrice. So one of the people Virgil meets in New York is this lady driving the car. Now, normally, if I was doing a speaking presentation in person, I would ask the audience if they know who this lady driving the car is, but that's really not appropriate for the Zoom call. But this lady is none other than Madam C.J. Walker. You see here, she is driving some of her family. And Madam C.J. Walker is an interesting luminary. She grew up very poor and uneducated. She began as a teenager working for a lady who was making beautification products for the African-American community. Well, after a number of years teaching herself chemistry, she went out on her own and developed her own business in the same sphere, beautification products for the market, the African-American female market. And she was very successful, took a long time, but she developed a sales force of about 10,000 female agents across the country, setting up their own little franchises under her umbrella. She became so famous and wealthy that at the height of her career, she was earning approximately $15 million a year in today's dollars. Okay, so back around 1910, that was the equivalent of about, I'd say about $500,000 to $700,000 back then. So in today's dollars, it's about 15 million a year. Not bad for an African-American lady who had no education. She became the first African-American millionairess in the United States. She had a mansion built for her family in Irvington, Westchester County. And she was very influential politically and academically throughout the United States. I mentioned the Clef Club, Virgil's roommate and Virgil himself as a waiter is working at the Clef Club. You could see the pretty large band there. I know the picture is not the best in terms of crispness, but at the center with the baton is the conductor, band leader, and president of the Clef Club, James Reese Europe. The Clef Club was famous for its ragtime and its jazz playing, which became a phenomenon in the United States. They not only played to mixed race audience in Harlem, but they also played privately at the homes and mansions of the very rich and famous, the Stuyvesants, for example, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Fishes. And they were very influential in music across the country. There you could see a little closer the conductor with some of his orchestra. The date on the bottom is 1914. Now here's a picture of James Reese Europe, enlarged. He decides to join a newly formed regiment called the 15th New York Negro National Guard Regiment, newly formed in 1916. So let me give you a little background. After the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, in which over 100 Americans perished, the United States didn't declare war on Germany. What they did in the Wilson administration was began their preparedness. In the event that America joined the Allied forces, France and Britain and Russia, etc., to join against the Central Powers. So one of the things that the administration did was form 4 Negro regiments. This regiment in Harlem was one of them. Now, back in the day, any regiments of color were led by senior officers who were white. That basically did not change until President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948. So when this regiment and other regiments like it were formed, the senior officers were white, the junior officers were officers of color, the NCOs and the soldiers were also of color. Now, James Reesher, by heart and by occupation, was a musician and a band leader. He was hell-bent on having the biggest and best band in the American Army. So he cajoled his commanding officer, Colonel William Haywood, who was very politically connected in New York as an attorney and also as a fundraiser for the current governor back then, Governor Whitman. And he helped him raise money to form a 62-piece band for the regiment. And it was Lieutenant Europe and his sidekick, Noble Cecil, who became the, I lost my train of thought. I was doing really good there for a second. If you saw the movie The Blues Brothers, Jake and Elwood, yes, that is who I'm trying to think. They became the Jake and Elwood of this regiment in forming this huge eclectic band that included recruits from Puerto Rico, because Lieutenant Europe had to get windward instrument players from Puerto Rico that knew what they were doing. He couldn't find them in New York. So some people ask me, you know, why did I write a book that included troops of color or this regiment specifically? I am a member of the World War I Historical Association, and I have written an article that will be appearing in their September edition about the deployment and politics of troops of color in the First World War between the American and their allies, the British and the French. And one of the reasons, or 3 of the reasons I would say, that I wrote or chronicled this regiment was their excellent combat record. The regiment had one of the best combat records of any regiment in the history of the United States Army. It's ironic that the regiment and others like it did not fight with the American Army in France. They fought with the French Army, specifically the French Fourth Army. That's an odd situation in and of itself, but the book chronicles why that happened and the politics around it. Also, I chronicled how the American and French armies treated troops of color. I did that in the article. I also portrayed that in the book. Very interesting, the dynamics of how the troops of color were utilized, how they were treated between the Americans and their allies in France. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, is their band. that became a transformational phenomenon in France, and the phenomenon of jazz as part of the French culture lives with that country today. So Virgil, and I'll get to why I named the book The Reluctant Soldier. The Reluctant Soldier, I titled the book that way because Virgil is teaching the undergraduate students English literature, and he's finding that many of his students are leaving to join the army, and he's got almost no one to teach. So based out of some sense of obligation, some sense of guilt, he decides to join the regiment too. And it's one of the ways that this regiment, probably the dominant way this regiment recruits people, is they march up and down Fifth Avenue and they play martial music like Onward Christian Soldiers, and like a Pied Piper, they entice young men to join the regiment. And that's a very unique way of recruiting, but that's how they did it. And Virgil is one of these recruits. So he joins, and he goes off to war when America declares war in April of 1917. And the book chronicles how the United States declared war in April. It was through what's known as the Zimmerman telegram. And again, I don't want to get into that, but that was a very interesting piece of espionage that the British intercepted, gave it to the Wilson administration. And after a few weeks, the administration decided to declare war with Congress in support. So the regiment goes off to war, goes off to train in South Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina. And, there is an incident that happens there. It seemed kind of obvious, especially to the mayor, who tried desperately not to have the regiment come. But when you have 3,000 troops of color armed with rifles going to the Jim Crow South, specifically South Carolina, something as bad is going to happen, and it did. So subsequent to this incident, the regiment was sent back north. They boarded a ship in Hoboken and went across the pond to France around New Year's Day of 1918. One of the characters portrayed in the book is Virgil's company commander, Captain Hamilton Fish, of the famous Fish family. The lineage and his ancestors are well known in New York, much like the Kennedys in Massachusetts. And it is accurate. He did live to be almost 103. He was a congressman in New York City in the 1920s up until about 1944. So now the regiment is in France. And one of the interesting things that I document in the book is this Leonard letter. The letter came from General Pershing's headquarters, and it basically stated that the troops of color were not to fraternize with the French population. Knowing the French a little bit, like I do in my travels in France, they completely disregarded this directive because they were pretty desperate in getting troops to fend off the Germans, and they were going to treat any troops with dignity that was required to defeat the enemy. Virgil is injured a few times during his trials and tribulations with the regiment. And he also is working with the liaison officer from the French army, a Captain Henri Levin. And Captain Levin is a very his character, which I've made up, is copiously spread throughout the book in the 1920s and 1930s, and I'll get to him a little further in the presentation. There you see a picture of part of the band. On the left is the conductor and Lieutenant Europe. They're playing. The band was separated from the regiment from time to time to play for the wounded French soldiers and the French civilians. Now, as I mentioned about the band and how instrumental they were in not only the regiment, but in the army and also in French society. The French at that time, they had been spending almost 4 years in war with Germany, and they had lost a whole lot of soldiers. To be specific, about 1.4 million killed in action. Just to give you a little lay of the land on that figure, 1.4 million, if you add up all of America's killed in action from the Revolution in the 1770s to 1781, all the way to the Iraqi War, our killed in action in America does not equal the amount killed in France during those 4 years. And France is a smaller country than the United States. So it gives you some of the dynamics of the catastrophe in casualties that the French suffered. So much so that just about every family had a member killed or seriously wounded. And the morale of the French people were very low. But there were two major things that really helped lift the spirits of the French people. One was the doughboys, the colloquial term for the American soldiers, the doughboys coming into France to help fight side by side with them, and also the band that inoculated the society with this new music called jazz. And it really awakened a sense of spirit in them that gave them a boost when they really needed it. There you can see part of the regiment in the front lines. They're wearing not American uniforms, but French uniforms. This regiment was heralded by spending 191 consecutive days in the front line, more than any American unit. They were the first American unit to cross the Rhine River at the armistice, after the armistice, I should say. And they were the only regiment where the entire regiment was decorated by the French army. If anyone who's on the call has seen pictures, documentaries, or movies about the First World War, you'll see that the area that's called no man's land, the landscape was pretty much denuded, similar to like a lunar landscape. There is a picture here of American Marines at the Battle of Belleau Wood. And you could see the trees being pretty much deforested in that area. There's another picture of the landscape. Again, it looks like it's out of some science fiction movie, but it was all too real. The men walking on these boards were called duck boards. And if you didn't walk on them and you fell off into the mud, you might never resurface. There's another picture of the regiment getting their awards from the French army. The gentleman at the extreme left is Colonel Haywood, the commander of the regiment, and very much an advocate and strong voice for this regiment in their fight to be equal amongst men. So one of the things that I really was interested in, even as a teenager, was not only the physical catastrophe of the war, where 10 million soldiers in total were killed in this 4-year conflict, and 10 million civilians, and about 40 million worldwide due to the Spanish flu pandemic, which I also chronicle in the book. But never in human history, never, has 4 empires dissolved in less than a half a decade. So at the end of World War I, Imperial Russia became the Soviet Union. Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up into smaller Slavic countries. The Ottoman Empire was divided between Turkey and other smaller countries like Iraq, Iran, Syria, countries that have caused a lot of consternation in the latter part of the 20th and early 21st century. The German Empire became the Weimar Republic, which was very short-lived, and eventually became Nazi Germany. The British and French empires were never the same. And the only 2 countries that increased their stature on the world stage after this war was Japan and the United States. And we all know what happened with Japan and the United States a score of years later. So the effects of the war still live with us today. In fact, I could just state that Ukraine was created as a buffer state between Germany and Russia after this war. And less than a decade later, in the late 1920s, the Soviet Union invaded and took over Ukraine. There was a great famine in the early 30s in Ukraine. And then Germany invaded Ukraine in 1941. So you see a lot of history that goes on back and forth, and obviously Ukraine lives with us today in their conflict. So once the war ends, the soldiers of color, along with their white brothers, return back to the United States. And there is a period in the summer of 1919 known as the Red Summer. It's known as the Red Summer because a number of riots break out throughout the country. So if you think of the riots that took place in 2020 due to the killing of George Floyd, it was like that, but on steroids. So several hundred people were killed. Thousands of buildings were burnt down. It was a bad time in the summer of 1919. Moving on into the 1920s, early 1921, Virgil's wife passes away unexpectedly. And shortly thereafter, he goes back to see his family in Fredericksburg, and an incident happens where he kills a white man in self-defense, and he decides not to stand trial, but to take his money out of the bank, bribe a Maltese steamer captain, and heads on off to the other side of the pond, specifically where the ship is going, and that is in Liverpool, England. He doesn't know anyone there. The only person he knows is in France, and that person was his liaison officer, as I mentioned earlier, Captain Henri Levin. So he decides to make some money in England and cross the channel, go to Paris and find this liaison officer and see if he could start to scratch out a living in Paris. Eventually, he finds his liaison officer, who is now a Paris police detective, and Detective Levin shows compassion. He hires Virgil as his chauffeur, and his confidant. So now Virgil is in Paris, and it's in the 1920s, and the jazz age is upon that country, specifically in Paris. The jazz and the bohemian life in Paris takes place, and that's why I kind of mentioned Midnight in Paris, the movie, because it does chronicle that era. So Virgil meets a lot of celebrities there. As a literary person, he stumbles into a bookstore called Shakespeare and Company, and he meets the owner. Her name is Sylvia Beach, who hailed from New Jersey and went to Paris before World War I and opens up this English-speaking bookstore called Shakespeare and Company, which is still there today on the left bank in Paris as an English bookstore. So she's not only the owner, but she is kind of, that bookstore becomes a hub for literary celebs in Paris. And they congregate there to banter about and to argue and cajole each other about literature and many other things. And some of the people that are there, specifically James Joyce, who writes this odd novel, famous to become Ulysses. And the person who publishes this book, Ulysses, is none other than our bookstore owner, Sylvia Beach. I think the person that congregates there the most and is the most vocal and narcissistic is Ernest Hemingway, who regales everyone with his exploits in Italy as an ambulance driver in the First World War, and his experience with watching bullfights, et cetera, et cetera. Also, the other celebrities are Gertrude Stein and her partner, Alice B. Toklas, and others. Another one I'll just mention is Eugene Bullard, who I call a Renaissance man. He was a boxer professionally before the war, and he is the only African-American fighter pilot in the French army in World War I. Somehow he manages to survive that, and he becomes the business manager for African-American jazz musicians in Paris. He's also a very good drum player. So the book morphs from tales of war to an Agatha Christie type of motif. In the 1920s, Virgil and his mentor, Detective Levin, are solving 3 specific serial murders in Paris. All 3 have a basis of fact in them. I just embellished and expanded on each one of these. The first is serial killing, political assassinations. The second is medical malpractice. And the third is the killing of orphans for profit. So if there's we have a question and answer period if you want to ask me about these. But one of the interesting ways that these cases are solved is through the use of new technology called fingerprints. So I detail how these murder cases evolve and how they eventually are solved. And early in the presentation, I mentioned fact versus fiction, and I spent a lot of my research talking about and articulating these places like Le Dôme, a very famous cafe in France, in Paris. And I had to be very specific about the accuracy because there are people in France reading my book in French, and they know if I am not being accurate. And good thing my publisher hasn't called me out on that. It's Club Zelly, a blurry picture, but that's the nightclub that Eugene Bullard is the business manager of. There's no prohibition there. And the last luminary I'll talk about is the famous and none other than Josephine Baker. Now, Josephine is the only female American to receive military honors in France. She is the only female American who received the highest French award and was decorated at the Pantheon with the likes of great artistic people and other great French people. That's kind of ironic since she grew up in St. Louis. And at the age of 12, she was dancing on the streets of St. Louis to earn money for her sisters. At the age of 13, she gets married for the first time. By the time she's 16, she's married twice and divorced twice. She joins a dance troupe, which eventually makes its way to New York. And in 1925, when she is 19, they cross the Atlantic and land in Paris eventually. And by 1926, she has her own revue. She is a phenomenon in Paris due to her singing and more so for her dancing in exotic costumes. The one that is on this slide is probably the most conservative one I could find in the public domain. This slide shows Josephine in the 1920s with her pet cheetah by the name of Chiquita. And the picture on the right is her after World War II, where she is chronicled as a French resistance fighter. She used to write military notes in invisible ink on her music sheet, along with doing other things. She eventually adopted 13 children, one of whom wrote a biography about her life. One of the times I visited France, I went to her chateau outside of Paris. That's her chateau, Lucien. And as you could see, even though the picture isn't so great, it's not a bad place to live. She held some interesting parties there, by the way. So anyway, Virgil, getting back to Virgil, he's raising his new family and everything is going pretty nicely in the 1920s. But in the early 30s, Paris and France are going through turmoil, political turmoil between the Communist Party and the Fascist Party in France. So he decides to move his family to a quieter area called the Champagne region. And he gets a job helping out one of the houses of Champagne there. And he's taking care of machinery, and he's also doing work with the champagne bottles. He becomes an assistant riddler. That's someone who turns champagne bottles in order to make sure that they mature properly. So things are going pretty well there in the 1930s in the quiet region of Champagne. But this slide portrays what will become the future of Europe. In the Second World War, the protests that are going on, the political turmoil in the 1930s. So 1940 comes around and the Second World War is declared, and Germany invades France, including the Champagne region. And again, Virgil and his family become embroiled in another war. His wife, more so than he, become involved in the French resistance. She is taken away after she is caught trying to help a Jewish family escape the Gestapo. he has to escape, go to Paris, and he is forced into joining the French resistance against his better judgment. But the book regales his escapades and his missions against the Gestapo and the Nazis in Paris, his hiding out in the sewers of Paris, and also in the catacombs. And eventually the war ends. Some of the handiwork of the French resistance, liberation of Paris. And that's pretty much my spiel. There's a lot in the book between war, murder, romance, all of that good stuff. So, and I've gotten good reviews, knock on wood. My grandfather, Morris Rubenstein, was in the 82nd All-American Infantry Division. He was gassed in France. The 82nd became the 82nd Airborne. Part of my trips to France was going through the route where the 82nd Infantry Division went in France. My father was in World War II in a military police battalion in France. I also donate money to each book I sell to the Wounded Warrior Project that you probably see advertised on television. And I will take any questions, comments, criticisms. I'll also spend a minute or two at the end to hawk the sale of my book, if that's okay with everybody. That's basic.
Fine.
That's, you know, but I'll take any questions or comments or whatever.
I love that your character went to City College. My dad went to City College and was a waiter to get through college.
Okay, yeah, I thought that would be appropriate for someone living in Harlem.
Yes, great school. And I am wondering, did you write it in French or write it in English? And if you wrote it in English, how did you get it translated to French?
That's a very good question. I wrote it in English. My English manuscript was translated and adapted into French. And I had it. I had a contact who had a contact that published it in Paris. And so the book was actually pre-published. My English version, it was published in September of last year.
And do you think the reason for the book, a lot of it was because of your grandfathers and what they went through?
I was always enamored by the First World War, because if there wasn't a First World War, there wouldn't have been a second. I mean, I know we're all focused by America's great participation in the Second World War, but geopolitically, the First World War was like an earthquake with a 9.0 on the Richter scale. It was these shockwaves geopolitically and economically that forced the issue of a Second World War. There would not have been a Hitler or a Mussolini or a Stalin, or maybe even a Lenin, if there was not a First World War.
I think that it was interesting then that you spoke so much about, you know, the troops of color and these wonderful African-American women. What made you decide to incorporate that into the book?
Well, I'm not a historian. I didn't, even though I know a lot about the era, I didn't want to make it another history, because that story's been told. the horse is out of the barn on that one. And there are people that are better than I in telling specific history. I wanted to make it a multidiscipline type of book where people of different ilk can enjoy it. I mean, I've had women that have really enjoyed the book because of the cultural background that the book lends itself to, after the war. I have to describe the difference in clothing in Paris, but from the Lady Edith hats that were worn before the war to the cloche flapper hats that were worn in the 1920s. So I portray that in the book, and it makes it for a more personalized story from the aspect of one individual.
I would like to read it. We do have copies right now. We are going through a transition as far as we're not in our temporary library yet, but we definitely do have copies of the book. And we also have copies of Midnight in Paris, which is a great movie. I absolutely love that movie. Do we have any other questions from anyone else? This is going to be on YouTube, so please tell people that and I will tell people that we're signed up and weren't able to make it. Mark, I would love to see you come back sometime and just do a talk about the Troops of Color and, the work that they did with the French. I had no idea about that, so.
I mean, there was it was a completely different dynamic. So maybe once my article is out in public, maybe we could do that in the near future.
Yes, especially Connecticut now has where there has to be more education to high school students about Black history. I think that's a really good topic for kids to learn about. So, yeah, it was fast. You have a great imagination. I give you a lot of credit. Do you want to just say anything else about how you went about finding a publisher and that process before we go?
What's that? I'm sorry.
Oh, did you want to say anything about how you went about finding a publisher and the publishing process before we go?
I mean, I did through connections find a French publisher. I did self-publish my book in English. So that was a route that I went. So my book is on the Kindle Direct publishing platform, which is Amazon. So in English, my book is on the Amazon platform. All you got to do is type in The Reluctant Soldier. My book will come up, and it could be purchased either on paperback or ebook. Okay. The other thing is on my website. If an individual wants my book signed, not that my autograph is anything to speak of, but if a person wants an autographed copy of the English or the French version, they can just go to my website, just like they would do with Amazon or any other type of platform, and use their credit card, and I will sign the book and ship it to the individual. Or if they want to do it by snail mail, and they're not comfortable with the credit card, all they have to do is send me an email. You could see my email on this last slide. Just send me an email. I'll give you my address. You could send me the check for the book, which would be $20. It's a little cheaper that way. If you want to do it that way, I'll sign it and ship it off to you. So that's my little infomercial on how to do it.
And how did you find the French publisher?
My neighbor who grew up in Paris, has a literary individual, a novelist and an educator, professor, who knows the publisher in Paris. The publisher is Boulan Press in Paris, Bulland. And this is what the book looks like.
Yeah,
in
the
English.
book looks beautiful.
And you could see these are the people and places I talked about in the presentation.
Yeah, the book was beautifully made. It's really, really nice looking book.
And on my website, I do have free articles like blogs. They take 5 or 10 minutes to read about a whole bunch of different things. Anywhere from the execution of Nurse Edith Cavell to spiritualism, seances, and the Great War, etc. And Josephine Baker, a star at the age of 20. So I've got a number of different articles that are easy to read, 5 or 10 minutes in length on my website. I do that as a service for interested individuals.
I think it's great. You're a very interesting person, and I'm glad that you were able to join us tonight. And any other last questions from anyone? All right, so if anyone is interested, it will be on YouTube. And if you want the book, contact me or Mark. And I appreciate you doing this for us, Mark. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mara. And I would look forward, if you're interested, to take you up on that next event on the politics and deployment of troops of color in the Great War.
Yes, I am on the board of the Winterberry Historical Society, and that seems right up our alley. So I will be in touch, and thank you to everyone who came tonight.
All right, thanks a lot, Mara. Thank you for hosting. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for doing this for us.
All right, take care now.